This playlist collects together and organizes the segments of the lecture covering Rachel's chapter on euthanasia. And in this chapter, we learn that Rachel's himself died of cancer, but that he didn't change his view on euthanasia as a result of his experiences. In the chapter, Rachel begins by relaying a couple of stories of people who had terminal illnesses, who experienced excruciating pain for a relatively extended period of time before succumbing to their illness. The first example that he gives us is the story of the death of Jonathan Swift, which he informs us took 8 years, and that during this time Swift's pain was so intense that in his blinded eyes that he was actually trying to claw them out, and that they had to take precautions to prevent him from committing suicide and other things. The second story that he tells us about is a story related to secondhand by this journalist Alsop, who also died of cancer, but who wrote an account of his time in the cancer ward with this other cancer patient who died of cancer that's named Jack. Now, these accounts are probably pretty upsetting. They are definitely terrible, but Rachel's tells us that it's important that we make an effort to try and get some insight into the kind of tremendous agony that people can at times experience as a result of illness that is terminal and will ultimately result in their death. And he thinks that we can't actually truly comprehend just how awful the lives of these people were at the very ends of their lives without having experienced that sort of thing ourselves, because it's just so all-encompassing and intense. But he thinks it's important that we try and get some indirect sense of this. Now, my mother died of cancer, and she went through a period like this at the very end where pain medications could no longer adequately medicate her for the pain that she was experiencing. So even today, with the advanced medications that we have, situations like this do really arise. They are real situations that are part of the lives of people in everyday America. Having given us some exposure to the sorts of situations that he has in mind, Rachel then goes on to articulate what he thinks of as the main idea or the central intuition behind the argument from Mercy. So we'll talk about that. Then we'll look at the first version of the argument from Mercy that he considers, a version that's grounded in utilitarianism, the ethical doctrine that we examined earlier in the class. And he presents this argument and then criticizes the argument. And his criticisms of the argument are largely, well, completely related to its assumption of that utilitarian principle of utility, that greatest happiness principle, as Mill calls it. And so he presents this argument, then rejects this argument, and we might wonder why it is that he is bothering to present this argument to us. But I think the rationale for this in his mind is that he wants us to get a motivation for and an understanding of the modifications that he wants to introduce in reformulating the argument into the final version that he presents, which I call the everyone's best interest version of the argument for mercy, which is the final version that he presents for us. And I think his consideration and ultimate rejection of the utilitarian argument provides us with insight into the additional considerations and complexities that the argument for mercy needs to take into account, motivating them, showing us that they are important things that need to be considered, and that the decision isn't a single dimension. It isn't a quick decision, an easy decision. So after he discusses these cases of these people who experience these agonizing deaths, he articulates the main idea of the argument for mercy. And he tells us on page 153 that if a person prefers and even begs for death as the only alternative to lingering on in this kind of torment, the kind of torment he's referring to is agony so great that you want to scratch out your own eyes, or that you can't help but moan and cry in your bed at night, only to die anyway after a while, then surely it's not immoral to help this person die sooner. So this, he thinks, is the crux, the important intuition that an argument for mercy is trying to capture and codify, so that we can understand what it is that justifies the designation of this action as being not immoral or morally permissible. So in the next segment, we'll turn our attention to the utilitarian formulation and Rachel's criticisms thereof.